Mr. Rivera, you have 48 hours to remove that eyesore or we'll have it demolished. Patricia Whitmore's voice crackled through the phone, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. And don't think your little petition with 30 signatures. We'll save you. I've got the entire board behind me. Daniel Rivera gripped his phone tighter, watching through his kitchen window as his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, placed another bouquet of wildflowers at the base of his mailbox sculpture. The twisted metal and ceramic piece had become an unexpected shrine in the 3 weeks since the HOA declared war on it. What started as a simple artistic mailbox had somehow evolved into the epicenter of a neighborhood uprising that would ultimately expose decades of discrimination and transform a small suburban community forever. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same woman who'd spent months trying to force him from the neighborhood would soon be begging for his forgiveness. But that revelation lay buried beneath layers of bureaucratic warfare, hidden agendas, and a truth so explosive it would shake the very foundation of Whitmore's carefully constructed empire. The sculpture that Patricia deemed an abomination would not only remain standing but would become the town's first official landmark, with Daniel's name etched permanently into local history. The petition she'd dismissed so arrogantly would grow to over 2,000 signatures, but not before she'd unleash a campaign of harassment so vicious it would ultimately destroy her own reputation and career. As Daniel stared at the gathering crowd of supporters in his front yard, he couldn't have imagined that this battle would uncover Patricia's illegal financial dealings, her systematic targeting of minority homeowners, and the shocking family secret that had driven her vendetta against him specifically. The next 48 hours would see emergency city council meetings, a dramatic confrontation that would be filmed and go viral, and the exposure of corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. The modest postal worker, who'd simply wanted to honor his late father's memory with a handcrafted mailbox, would become the unlikely hero who brought down one of the most powerful HOA presidents in the state. But first, he had to survive the next 48 hours. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting Daniel from his coffee and morning routine. Patricia Whitmore's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Mr. Rivera, this is your final warning. The mailbox goes, or we take legal action." Daniel set down his mug, the ceramic clicking against the counter, with more force than intended. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've told you repeatedly, it's fully compliant with postal regulations. I have the documentation. I don't care about postal regulations. I care about property values and neighborhood standards. That monstrosity is bringing down the entire street." Through his window, Daniel could see the sculpture catching the morning light. The twisted copper and steel formed an abstract tree, its branches reaching skyward, while ceramic birds nested in the metalwork. His father had taught him welding in their garage, and every curve represented hours of careful craftsmanship. The base incorporated the required mailbox function seamlessly, but the artistic elements transformed it into something far more significant, a memorial to the man who'd raised him alone after his mother's death. The Architectural Review Committee never formally rejected it, Daniel said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "The committee answers to the board, and the board answers to me. You have 48 hours. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, then at the sculpture, then at the small crowd already beginning to form on his lawn. Mrs. Chen was there again, her silver hair catching the breeze as she tended to the flowers. Community members had started leaving. The Johnsons from 3 houses down were setting up a small folding table with coffee and donuts. Tom Martinez, the high school art teacher, was taking photographs for what he called documentation purposes. This hadn't been part of the plan when Daniel had first moved to Willowbrook Estates 2 years ago. He'd thought he was joining a quiet, suburban community. The HOA fees were reasonable, the neighborhood was well maintained, and the architectural guidelines seemed standard. He'd submitted his mailbox design through proper channels, received verbal approval from the committee, and spent 3 months crafting the piece in his garage. The problems started the day. After installation, first came the anonymous complaints, then the formal citations, then the board meetings where his requests to speak were mysteriously tabled. Patricia Whitmore had made it clear from the beginning that she considered his presence in the neighborhood a mistake, though she'd never explicitly said why. Now, watching his neighbors rally around his cause, Daniel realized this fight had never been about the mailbox at all. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Maria, saw the news report. "This is bigger than you think. Call me news report." Daniel grabbed his laptop and searched for Willowbrook Estates mailbox. The first result made his stomach drop. Channel 7 had picked up the story, framing it as local artist fights HOA tyranny. The accompanying photo showed his sculpture surrounded by supporters, but the caption identified him as Daniel Rivera, community organizer. He'd never organized anything in his life, but as he scrolled through the comments, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. Someone had posted Patricia Whitmore's home address, along with a message, "This is what systemic racism looks like. Time to make some noise." He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Whatever this was becoming, he needed to get ahead of it before someone got hurt. The crowd had tripled by the time Daniel returned from his emergency grocery run. What had started as a handful of neighbors offering support had evolved into something that looked suspiciously like a protest. Someone had brought a PA system. Someone else had printed signs. Reading "Art is not a crime" and "Support local artists." A local news van was parked across the street. Its satellite dish extended toward the sky like a mechanical flower-seeking signal. Daniel, Mrs. Chen waved him over to where she was coordinating with other residents. "Channel 7 wants to interview you and the city council member called She's coming by this afternoon." "Mrs. Chen, I just wanted to keep my mailbox. This is getting out of hand, is it?" The voice belonged to Tom Martinez, who approached with his camera still hanging around his neck. "Because I've been doing some research, and your situation isn't unique. In the past 5 years, Patricia Whitmore has filed formal complaints against 12 different homeowners. Want to guess what they all have in common?" Daniel didn't need to guess. He'd already started connecting the dots himself. The Patels with their garden shrine, the Washingtons with their decorative fence, the Nugents with their traditional lanterns, all approved by the architectural committee, all later targeted by the board. "And all minority families," added Sarah Johnson, who'd been quietly listening. "My husband and I have been here 8 years. We've never received a single complaint, and our backyard shed has been purple for 3 years." The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, but Daniel knew accusations without evidence would only make things worse. "Look, I appreciate everyone's support, but I don't want this to turn into something ugly. Let me handle this through proper channels." "The proper channels are what got you into this mess," Tom said. "Sometimes you need to make noise to get justice." Before Daniel could respond, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Patricia Whitmore emerged from the driver's seat, her business suit immaculate despite the morning heat. She surveyed the crowd with the expression of someone who'd discovered something unpleasant on her shoe. "Mr. Rivera," she called out, voice carrying across the lawn. "I need to speak with you privately." The crowd parted reluctantly as Daniel walked toward her. He could feel dozens of eyes watching, phones recording, cameras clicking. Whatever happened next would be documented and shared within minutes. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you want to discuss this, we can do it properly. Set up a meeting with the board. Follow the procedures. The procedures are finished," she interrupted. "I'm offering you one last chance to handle this quietly. Remove the sculpture today, and I'll forget about the code violations. Keep it up, and I'll file for an injunction. Your little fan club won't help you in court." Daniel glanced back at the crowd, at Mrs. Chen's worried face, at Tom's camera still recording. These people had put themselves on the line for him. He couldn't back down now. "The sculpture stays," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you want to fight this, then let's fight it properly. But I'm not being bullied into giving up something that means everything to me." Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "You have no idea what you're up against, Mr. Rivera. This neighborhood has standards, and I intend to maintain them." As she turned to leave, Daniel caught something in her expression, not just anger, but something deep more, something personal. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called out, "why is this so important to you? It's just a mailbox." She paused, her hand on the car door. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Because some things are worth fighting for," she said quietly, "and some people need to learn their place." The sedan pulled away, leaving Daniel standing. in his driveway with the growing realization that this battle was about much more than he'd understood. The sculpture had become a symbol, the conflict, a catalyst, and he was about to discover just how deep the neighborhood's secrets ran. The email arrived at 11:23 p.m., 3 days after Patricia's ultimatum had expired. Daniel was in his garage, stress welding a new piece to keep his hands busy. When his phone chimed with the notification, the sender was anonymous, but the message was clear. Check the county records. Whitmore doesn't own what she claims. Follow the money. Attached were PDFs of property deeds, tax records, and financial documents spanning back 15 years. Daniel's welding torch suddenly felt heavy in his hands as he scrolled. Through the files on his phone screen, Willowbrook Estates had been built on land that once belonged to the Rivera family, his grandfather's farm, sold in 1987 to pay for medical bills. The buyer was listed as Whitmore Development LLC, with Patricia Whitmore as the sole owner. But according to the tax records, the company had never paid property taxes on the original parcel. Instead, those taxes had been mysteriously transferred to a shell company that existed only on paper. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for his laptop. If these documents were authentic, Patricia hadn't just been targeting minority homeowners, she'd been systematically defrauding the county for over a decade. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Daniel Rivera. Yes, my name is Elena Vasquez. I'm an investigative journalist with the Tribune. I understand you're having some trouble with your HOA. How did you get this number? I've been investigating housing discrimination in suburban communities for 6 months. Your story caught my attention, but what I found goes much deeper than a mailbox dispute. Can we meet? Daniel looked around his garage, at the half-finished sculpture on his workbench, at the tools his father had passed down to him. Hours ago, he'd been a postal worker with a simple problem. Now he was apparently sitting on evidence of fraud that could bring down one of the most powerful people in the county, Ms. Vasquez. I think someone just sent me information you need to see. They met at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, away from the neighborhood and prying eyes. Elena Vasquez was younger than Daniel had expected, with sharp eyes and a recorder that she placed on the table between them. The documents you received tonight he sent them, she said without preamble. I've been building a case against Patricia Whitmore for months, but I needed someone with standing to bring it forward. Your mailbox situation provided the perfect opportunity. You've been investigating her? Her and about a dozen other HOA presidents across the state. They've been running a sophisticated operation buying land through shell companies, avoiding taxes, then using their positions to drive out residents who might ask uncomfortable questions. Elena spread a series of photographs across the table, property records, bank statements, meeting minutes from HOA boards across 3 counties. The scope was staggering. The Patels you mentioned? They were asking questions about a special assessment that didn't appear in the official budget. The Washingtons started attending board meetings and requesting financial records. The Nugents hired a lawyer when their architectural committee approval was mysteriously reversed, and they all ended up targeted, Daniel said, pieces clicking into place. Exactly. But you're different. You're not just another homeowner. They can intimidate. You're the grandson of the man who originally owned this land. You have a legal claim that goes back decades. Daniel stared at the documents. What kind of claim? Your grandfather's sale included mineral rights and water access that were never properly transferred. Technically, Patricia Whitmore has been collecting rent from residents for land she doesn't legally own. The implications hit him like a physical blow. How many people are we talking about? 43 families in Willowbrook Estates, probably another 200 across her other developments. We're looking at millions in fraudulent taxes, illegal fees, and discriminatory practices. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from his sister. Emergency. Patricia Whitmore called my boss. She's trying to get me fired. Says I'm part of your campaign of harassment. He showed Elena the message. Her expression hardened. She's escalating. That means we're close to something she can't afford to lose. What do you need from me? I need you to file a formal complaint with the county. Not about the mailbox, about the property ownership. Once that's in motion, it becomes a public record. Then we can publish the story without fear of litigation. Daniel thought about his sister, about the neighbors who'd supported him, about the sculpture sitting in his front yard that had started this whole mess. He thought about his father, who'd taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. If I do this, how many people get hurt? The people who've been breaking the law get hurt. The families who've been paying illegal fees get justice. The choice is yours, but make it fast. I have reason to believe Whitmore is planning something drastic. Outside the diner, Daniel could see the first hints of dawn on the horizon. In a few hours, the neighborhood would wake up to another day of protests and media attention. But now he understood that the real battle was just beginning. What kind of drastic? Elena's expression was grim, the kind that involves demolition, crews, and emergency board meetings. She's going to try to end this before it goes any further. Daniel looked at the documents spread across the table, at the evidence of years of systematic fraud and discrimination. Then he thought about his mailbox sculpture, standing in his front yard like a beacon of resistance. Where do I sign? The demolition crew arrived at 5:47 a.m., their diesel engines rumbling through the quiet neighborhood like mechanical thunder. Daniel woke to Mrs. Chen pounding on his door, her face flushed with panic and indignation. They're trying to tear it down. Patricia brought a crew with sledgehammers. Daniel pulled on clothes and rushed outside to find a surreal scene unfolding on his front lawn. Two men in hard hats were setting up equipment around his mailbox sculpture, while Patricia Whitmore stood nearby, clipboard in hand, directing operations like a general commanding troops. "Stop!" Daniel called out, but the larger of the two men was already raising a sledgehammer toward the copper branches of his sculpture. "You can't do this without a court order." "I have all the authority I need," Patricia replied, holding up an official-looking document. "Emergency action by the HOA board for violation of health and safety codes. The sculpture is declared a public hazard." It's what health and safety codes? Sharp metal edges, potential electrical hazard, obstruction of mail delivery. Each excuse was more ridiculous than the last, but Daniel could see the sledgehammer poised to strike. In desperation, he stepped directly in front of the sculpture. "You'll have to go through me." The man with the sledgehammer hesitated, looking to Patricia for guidance. That hesitation was all the time needed for the cavalry to arrive. Tom Martinez came running from his house with his camera. Sarah Johnson emerged from her front door with her phone, already recording. Mrs. Chen was on her cell phone, speaking rapidly in Mandarin to someone who was clearly being asked to spread the word. Within minutes, the demolition crew found themselves surrounded by angry neighbors, all of them recording, all of them demanding to know by what authority they were destroying private property. "This is still my property," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "And that's still my mailbox. You have no right to destroy it." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with. This neighborhood has rules, has standards, has been built on fraud for 15 years. Elena Vasquez's voice cut through the chaos as she approached with a larger camera crew. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Elena Vasquez with the Tribune. Would you care to comment on the county's investigation into your property ownership claims?" The blood drained from Patricia's face. "There's no investigation. Actually, there is. As of yesterday afternoon, when Mr. Rivera filed his formal complaint, the county attorney's office has opened a full review of all property transfers involving Whitmore Development LLC. Daniel watched Patricia's careful control disintegrate in real time. The composed businesswoman who'd terrorized his neighborhood for years was suddenly just a desperate person caught in a web of her own making. "You have no idea what you've done," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "This will destroy everything." "Maybe it should," Daniel replied. That's when Patricia made her fatal mistake. "You think you belong here," she screamed, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. "You think because your grandfather sold this land for pennies, you have some right to come back and destroy what I built. Your family ran away when things got tough. You don't get to come back now and play the victim." The crowd fell silent. Elena's camera crew captured every word. Tom's camera kept rolling. Dozens of phones recorded the moment Patricia Whitmore revealed the personal vendetta that had driven her campaign of harassment. Daniel felt the pieces clicking into place. "You knew my grandfather. I knew your whole family. Knew how you people couldn't handle the responsibility of ownership. Knew you'd sell out the moment things got difficult. You were there when he sold the land." Patricia's laugh was bitter. I was 17 years old, watching my father negotiate with a desperate old man who couldn't pay his bills. Do you know what it's like to watch your father build his fortune on someone else's misery? The truth hit Daniel like a physical blow. Your father was the buyer. Richard Whitmore bought this land for a fraction of its value from your grandfather, built his development company on that foundation. And I've spent my entire life trying to prove I was worthy of inheriting his empire. By systematically targeting anyone who reminded you of that original injustice, Patricia's composure shattered completely. By maintaining standards, by protecting property values, by ensuring this neighborhood remained what it was meant to be, Alina stepped forward, her recorder capturing every word. And what was it meant to be, Ms. Whitmore? Better than what came before. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the demolition crew had stopped their work to stare at the woman who'd just revealed the racist foundations of her entire worldview. Daniel looked at his sculpture, at the twisted metal and ceramic birds that had become a symbol of resistance. Then he looked at Patricia, seeing not a powerful adversary, but a broken person trapped by her own prejudices and family legacy. The sculpture stays, he said quietly, and if you want to fight this, we'll fight it properly. But you're done making decisions for this neighborhood. As if summoned by his words, 3 county sheriff's vehicles pulled up to the curb. Deputy Martinez, no relation to Tom, approached with a folder of documents. Ms. Whitmore, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of tax fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit housing discrimination. The demolition crew packed up their equipment without another word. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several neighbors approached Daniel to offer congratulations and support. As Patricia was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to Daniel one last time. You think you've won, she said, but you have no idea what you've inherited. Daniel watched the sheriff's car disappear down the street, then looked at his sculpture catching the morning light. Mrs. Chen was already back to tending the flowers. At its base, Tom was reviewing his footage with Alina. The neighborhood was returning to its normal rhythm. Generations. About the young woman who'd watched that transaction and built her life around the shame of it. About the cycles of injustice that could span decades if left unchallenged. The mailbox sculpture stood intact, its copper branches reaching toward the sky like a prayer answered. The emergency city council meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Thursday. Instead, he found himself looking at a crowd of nearly 300 people, with overflow seating set up in the lobby and a live stream broadcasting to viewers across the county. Alina Vasquez found him in the chaos, her press badge bouncing. As she navigated through the crowd, "Are you ready for this?" she asked, settling into the seat beside him. Kept expanding the scope of the case. What had started as a simple mailbox dispute had uncovered a corruption network spanning multiple counties and involving dozens of public officials. The county attorney's office finished their preliminary review, Alina said, sliding a folder. Across to him, the numbers are staggering. Daniel opened the folder to find a summary that made his stomach drop. Over 15 years, Patricia Whitmore and her associates had diverted more than $3.2 million in property taxes through shell companies and fraudulent transfers, services that had been systematically underfunded while a small group of developers profited. How many people knew? That's what tonight is about. The city council is voting on whether to launch a full investigation. Demeanor showed cracks of stress. The past week had been brutal for local government, with media attention and public pressure mounting daily. We're here tonight to address allegations concerning property ownership and taxation, irregularities in several residential developments, she began. Mr. Rivera, you have the floor. Daniel stood, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes watching him. A month ago, he'd been a postal worker who just wanted to honor his father's memory. Now he was the face of a movement that had exposed decades of systematic injustice. Your Honor, I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to keep my mailbox sculpture. But what I've learned in the past week has convinced me that staying silent would be a disservice to every family who's been cheated by this system. He outlined the evidence methodically, the fraudulent property transfers, the discriminatory enforcement patterns, the missing tax revenue that should have funded community services. This isn't just about me or my neighborhood. It's about whether we're going to hold people accountable when they abuse positions of trust. Want revenge? I don't want to destroy anyone's life, but I do want justice, and I want to make sure this never happens again. Mayor Torres nodded gravely. "Thank you, Mr. Rivera. We'll now hear from other affected parties." For the next hour, Daniel listened as neighbor after neighbor stood to share their experiences. The Patels described months of harassment over their garden shrine. The Washingtons talked about illegal fees and intimidation tactics. The Nugents explained how their architectural committee approval had been mysteriously reversed after they started asking questions about the budget. But the most powerful testimony came from someone Daniel hadn't expected, Patricia Whitmore's daughter, Lisa. "My name is Lisa Whitmore-Chun," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Patricia Whitmore is my mother." The room fell silent. Daniel turned to see Mrs. Chen in the front row, her face streaked with tears. "I married David Chen 15 years ago," Lisa continued. "We moved to Willowbrook Estates because we thought it would be a good place to raise our children. What I didn't know was that my mother had been systematically targeting families like ours families she considered unsuitable for the neighborhood. The personal dimension of the corruption was staggering. Patricia hadn't just been discriminating against strangers, she'd been discriminating against her own daughter's family. The flowers my mother-in-law has been placing at Mr. Rivera's sculpture aren't just gestures of support. They're memorials to the dreams my mother helped destroy. Mrs. Chen has been trying to grow a traditional garden for years. Puzzle, click into place. Mrs. Chen's gentle support, her immediate presence at his sculpture. "I'm here tonight to apologize," Lisa continued. "To Mr. Rivera, to all the families my mother has hurt, and to my own family for not speaking up sooner. I'm also here to announce that I'm donating my inheritance from Whitmore Development LLC to establish a fund for legal aid and community development in the affected neighborhoods." The crowd's reaction was thunderous, but Daniel was focused on Mrs. Chen, who was sobbing openly in the front row. "She is my daughter," Mrs. Chen whispered. "But she is also my neighbor. Family is not just blood. Family is who stands with you when everything falls apart." Mayor Torres called for order, but the emotional tenor of the meeting had shifted. This wasn't just about legal technicalities anymore, it was about healing a community that had been fractured by years of division and discrimination. The City Council will now vote on Resolution 2024-127, authorizing a full investigation into allegations of fraud and discrimination in residential development practices. The vote was unanimous. As the meeting concluded, Daniel found himself surrounded by reporters, neighbors, and activists who wanted to know what came next. But his attention was focused on the sculpture plans Tom Martinez was showing him on his phone. "What do you think?" Tom asked. "A community art garden where people can display sculptures. Cultural artifacts, traditional plants, whatever, represents their heritage." Daniel looked at the design, then at the crowd of people who'd come together to support justice. "I think it's exactly what this neighborhood needs." Outside the community center, Alina Vasquez was wrapping up her live broadcast. What began as a simple dispute over a mailbox has become a catalyst for examining systemic inequality in suburban communities. Federal investigators are now involved, and similar cases are being reported in at least 6 other states. Daniel walked past the news crews toward his car, but stopped when he saw a familiar figure leaning against a streetlight. Patricia Whitmore looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her exposed crimes and broken relationships. "I suppose you're satisfied now," she said as he approached. "No," Daniel replied. "I'm not satisfied. I'm sad. Sad that it took all this pain to get to the truth. Sad that your fear and prejudice destroyed so many lives, including your own." Patricia's laugh was bitter. "You think you understand, but you don't. You think this is about racism, about discrimination, but it's about order. It's about maintaining standards in a world that's falling apart." "Whose standards? Your father's. The ones that said my grandfather's family didn't deserve to keep their land. The ones that built something beautiful from nothing, built on theft and maintained through fear. That's not beauty, Patricia. That's just a pretty mask over an ugly foundation." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Daniel watched her go, feeling not triumph, but a deep sadness for the cycles of pain that had led to this moment. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister, saw the news. Dad would be proud. Daniel looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights, and thought about his father, in that garage, teaching him to bend metal into art. About his grandfather, forced to sell land that had been in the family for generations, about the sculpture standing in his front yard, a symbol of resistance that had become a catalyst for justice. The Mailbox War was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Daniel stood in what had once been the contentious corner of Willowbrook Estates, now transformed into the Rivera Community Art Garden. The space bloomed with sculptures, traditional plants, and cultural displays that represented the neighborhood's diverse heritage. His original mailbox sculpture stood at the center, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a beacon of community unity. The morning sun caught the copper branches, casting intricate shadows across the memorial plaques that honored families who'd been pushed out by discriminatory practices. Alina Vasquez had helped research and document their stories, ensuring that the garden served as both celebration and remembrance. Mr. Rivera, a young woman, approached with a notebook and camera. "I'm Jessica Kim from the Community College newspaper. I'm writing a story about grassroots activism. Could I ask you a few questions?" Daniel smiled, remembering his own reluctance to talk to reporters just months earlier. "Of course, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not an activist. I'm just a guy who wanted to keep his mailbox. But you've become a symbol of resistance to housing discrimination. I've become a symbol of what happens when communities come together." The resistance was already herein Mrs. Chen's quiet persistence, in the Patels' refusal to give up their garden shrine. In every family that refused to be intimidated, I just happened to be the person who finally made some noise. Jessica scribbled notes as they walked through the garden. "What's been the most surprising part of this whole experience?" Daniel paused beside a section where traditional Chinese lanterns hung from metal trees created by local high school students. "Learning that the things we think divide us are usually smaller than the things that unite us. Patricia Whitmore and I both lost our fathers young. We both inherited complicated legacies. We both wanted to honor our family's memories. The difference was that she chose fear and control, while I chose to trust my community." Speaking of Patricia Whitmore, how do you feel about her sentencing? The question brought back the mixed emotions Daniel had felt watching Patricia led away in handcuffs 3 months earlier. Federal prosecutors had built a case that resulted in 5 years in prison for tax fraud and conspiracy. Her development company was dissolved, with assets distributed to the defrauded communities. "I feel sad about it," Daniel said honestly. "She destroyed so many lives, including her own. But I also feel hopeful because her daughter Lisa has been working to make amends. The legal aid fund she established has helped dozens of families fight housing discrimination." They walked past a section where Mrs. Chen was teaching a group of children how to tend to traditional medicinal plants. Her face lit up when she saw Daniel. "Daniel, come see what we've accomplished." The garden plot was thriving with herbs and vegetables that had been forbidden under the old HOA rules. Children from the neighborhood came by after school to learn about different cultural traditions and help with the gardening. "Mrs. Chen has become our unofficial community coordinator," Daniel explained to Jessica. "She's the one who really made this work." Mrs. Chen waved dismissively. "I just plant things. You gave us the space to grow." The truth was more complex. After Patricia's arrest, the HOA had essentially collapsed. The remaining board members had voted to dissolve the organization entirely, returning control to individual homeowners and the city. The transition had been chaotic, but neighbors had stepped up to create new systems for community maintenance and decision-making. "The garden was just the beginning," Daniel said as they continued walking. "We've started a tool library, a childcare cooperative, and a neighborhood watch program that actually watches out for each other instead of looking for code violations." Jessica photographed the various sections of the garden, each one representing a different aspect of the community's transformation. "What advice would you give to other communities dealing with similar issues?" Daniel considered the question. As they approached the newest addition to the Garden A section, dedicated to stories of resilience and recovery. Local families had contributed artifacts, photos, and written accounts of their experiences with discrimination and their hopes for the future. "Don't wait for someone else to fix things," he said finally, "but also don't try to fix everything alone. The power of community is real, but it requires people to show up for each other consistently, not just during crises." His phone buzzed with a text from Tom Martinez. "Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up story. Something about the garden being nominated for a state award." Daniel showed the message to Jessica. The garden's been nominated for the Governor's Award for Community Innovation. The ceremony is next month. Will you attend? We'll attend, Daniel corrected. This was never about one person. It's about what a community can accomplish when it decides to stop accepting injustice as normal. As they finished the interview, Daniel noticed a familiar car pulling up to the curb. Alina Vasquez got out, followed by a man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the garden setting. Daniel, Alina called out. I want you to meet someone. This is Robert Hayes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's here about the federal investigation. Daniel shook hands with Hayes, who was looking around the garden with obvious surprise. Mr. Rivera, I'll be honest, I expected to find an angry community still dealing with the aftermath of corruption. Instead, I find this gestured at the thriving garden, the children learning from Mrs. Chen, the neighbors working together to maintain their shared space. What you're seeing is what happens when you remove the systems that divide people, Daniel said. It turns out most neighbors actually want to get along with each other. Hayes nodded slowly. That's actually why I'm here. Your case has become a model for federal housing policy reform. We're developing new guidelines for HOA oversight and community dispute resolution based on what you've accomplished here. Daniel felt a familiar mix of pride and discomfort. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate that, but I want to be clear. We didn't solve racism or fix housing discrimination. We just found a way to work together in spite of the systems that were designed to keep us apart. Which is exactly why your model is so valuable, Alina interjected. The federal investigation has uncovered similar patterns in over 40 communities across 12 states, but most of those communities are still fighting through the legal system. You've shown there's a path forward. That doesn't require waiting for justice to be served. Hayes pulled out a folder. We'd like to invite you to testify before Congress about community-based solutions to housing discrimination. Your voice could help shape federal policy for years to come. The request was overwhelming. Daniel looked around the garden at the children playing between the sculptures, at Mrs. Chen patiently teaching traditional gardening techniques, at the memorial plaques honoring families who'd been driven away by prejudice and greed. I'll need to talk to my community, he said. This was never about me becoming some kind of spokesperson. It was about neighbors taking care of each other. Which is exactly what makes your testimony so powerful, Hayes replied. You're not a professional activist or a policy expert. You're a postal worker who refused to let injustice stand. As Hayes and Alina left to tour other affected neighborhoods, Daniel found himself alone in the garden for the first time in months. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the memorial plaques and community sculptures. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his sister Maria. Hey, I saw the news about the federal testimony. Are you going to do it? Daniel sat down on a bench beside his original mailbox sculpture, the twisted metal and ceramic birds that had started this entire journey. I don't know. Part of me just wants to go back to being anonymous. I deliver mail. I make art in my garage. I tend my part of the garden. Simple life, but I keep thinking about all the families in other communities who are going through what we went through. If talking to Congress might help even one neighborhood avoid this kind of pain. Dad would have been proud of you, Maria said softly, not because you became famous, but because you stood up for what was right when it mattered. After the call ended, Daniel sat in the gathering dusk, watching the solar lights come on throughout the garden. Mrs. Chen had installed them herself, saying the space needed to be welcoming even after dark. Footsteps approached, and he looked up to see Tom Martinez with his camera. As always, mind if I join you? Daniel gestured to the bench. Still documenting everything. But tonight, I'm just here as a neighbor. Tom sat down, setting his camera aside. Alina asked me to give you this. He handed Daniel a thick envelope. Inside were letters, dozens of them from communities across the country that had heard about the Rivera Community Art Garden. People writing to ask for advice, Tom explained. Families dealing with discriminatory HOAs, communities trying to heal after corruption scandals, neighborhoods that want to create their own art gardens. Daniel flipped through the letters, each one representing a family or community struggling with the same issues they'd faced. A retirement community in Florida, where residents were being charged illegal fees. a suburb in Ohio where the HOA was systematically targeting immigrant families. A small town in Texas where a corrupt development company had been stealing from municipal services. "This is bigger than I thought," Daniel said quietly. "It was always bigger than you thought, but now people have hope that things can change." Daniel looked at his sculpture, at the garden that had grown around it, at the community that had formed in response to injustice. "Tom, what if we're wrong? What if this only worked because we got lucky? What if other communities try this and it doesn't work? Then at least they tried something, and maybe they'll find a different way that works for them." Tom picked up his camera again. "Mind if I take one more photo?" Daniel nodded, and Tom captured the moment. A man sitting beside his mailbox sculpture in a garden that had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conflict. "What's the photo for?" "Elena's book about the case. She's calling it the Mailbox War. How one sculpture changed everything." Daniel laughed. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Is it? 6 months ago, this was a neighborhood divided by fear and prejudice. Now it's a model for federal housing policy. A sculpture that was supposed to be demolished is about to become a state landmark." That seems pretty dramatic to me. As they sat in comfortable silence, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The angry phone call that had started it all. The crowd of neighbors who'd rallied to support him. The painful revelations about Patricia, Whitmore's family history and personal vendetta. The discovery of systematic fraud and discrimination, the long process of healing and rebuilding. "Tom, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just taken down the sculpture that first day?" "Every day," Tom replied, "but you didn't, and that made all the difference." Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Tomorrow we plant the winter vegetables. The children want to help. Can you be here at 9 a.m.? He showed Tom the message. "Want to document our winter planting ceremony? Wouldn't miss it?" As they walked back toward their respective houses, Daniel felt a sense of completion that had been missing for months. The legal battles were over. The community was healing. The garden was thriving. The federal investigation would continue. But the local work was done, or so he thought. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Daniel's own mail route. Irony that wasn't lost on him. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, with an official seal that made his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "Office of the Governor," the return address read, "State of California." Daniel sat in his kitchen, the letter unopened in his hands, remembering the last time official correspondence had disrupted his quiet life. But this felt different. The weight of the paper, the careful calligraphy of his address, the sense of ceremony rather than threat. He opened it carefully. "Dear Mr. Rivera, it is my honor to inform you that the Rivera Community Art Garden has been selected as the recipient of the Governor's Award for Community Innovation. The ceremony will be held at the state capitol on December 15th, with national media coverage and representatives from communities across the country who are implementing similar programs. Additionally, I would like to invite you to serve on the newly formed State Commission on Community Development and Housing Justice. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable as we work to prevent the kind of systematic discrimination that occurred in your neighborhood. Please know that your courage in standing up for what is right has inspired communities across the nation. The Willowbrook model is being studied and replicated in over 30 states. Sincerely, Governor Patricia Newsom." Daniel read the letter 3 times, then walked to his window and looked out at the garden. Mrs. Chen was there, as always, tending to the winter vegetables with a group of children from the neighborhood. The morning sun caught the copper branches of his sculpture, casting familiar shadows across the memorial plaques. 30 states. The number was staggering. His phone rang. "Elena Vasquez, calling from Washington, D.C. I assume you got the letter." "Knew about this. I helped write the commission proposal." "Daniel, what you started here has become a national movement. Communities are organizing, federal legislation is being drafted, and housing discrimination cases are being won using the precedent you set." Daniel sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. "Elena, I just wanted to keep my mailbox, and you did. But you also proved that communities don't have to accept injustice as normal. Do you have any idea how revolutionary that is?" Through his window, Daniel watched Tom Martinez arrive at the garden with his camera, still documenting everything. The high school art class was setting up their latest installation, a series of metal trees that would hold seasonal displays representing different cultural traditions. What exactly does the commission do? Reviews proposed housing developments for discriminatory practices, investigates complaints about HOA abuse, develops new models for community governance. Basically, it makes sure what happened in Willowbrook never happens again. And you think I'm qualified for that? I think you're the only person who's actually solved the problem instead of just studying it. After Alina hung up, Daniel sat in his kitchen for a long time, thinking about the path that had led him here. The scared postal worker who'd just wanted to honor his father's memory had somehow become the face of a national movement for housing justice. There was a knock at his door. Mrs. Chen stood on his porch, holding a small potted plant. "Good morning, Daniel. I brought you something." The plant was a small bonsai tree, its branches carefully shaped into an elegant curve that reminded him of his sculpture's copper branches. "Mrs. Chen, this is beautiful. What's the occasion?" "I heard about the governor's letter. The children want to plan a celebration?" And they sat in his kitchen looking out at the garden that had become the heart of their community. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? Are you happy with how everything turned out?" She was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands cradling the teacup. "I am happy that my granddaughter can plant flowers without fear. I am happy that my son-in-law can display his heritage proudly. I am happy that neighbors talk to each other instead of calling the police, but I am sad that it took so much pain to get here. I am sad that Patricia Whitmore's fear destroyed so many lives, including her own. I am sad that my daughter lost her mother to hatred." Daniel thought about Patricia, now serving her federal sentence, and about Lisa, who had devoted herself to making amends for her mother's crimes. The cycles of pain and healing were more complex than any news story could capture. "Do you think I should accept the governor's appointment?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "I think you should do what you did with the sculpture. Follow your heart, stand up for what's right, and trust your community to support you." The space had evolved far beyond what any of them had imagined. The tool library Tom had suggested now occupied a small shed decorated with murals painted by local teenagers. The child care cooperative met in a pavilion built by parents using techniques learned from YouTube videos. The Neighborhood Watch program had become a broader network of mutual aid that helped with everything from job searches to medical emergencies. As he worked, Daniel noticed something he'd missed before. The garden wasn't just a place, it was a model, a living example of what communities could become when they chose cooperation over conflict, when they refused to let fear divide them, when they insisted on justice not just for themselves, but for everyone. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Rivera, my name is Marcus Thompson. I live in Detroit. My HOA is trying to force me to remove a memorial to my son who died in Afghanistan. I saw your story on the news. Can you help?" Daniel stared at the message, then at the garden, then at the letter from the governor still sitting on his kitchen table. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. He typed back, "Yes, let's talk." That evening, Daniel called Alina to accept the commission appointment. Then he called Tom to ask if he wanted to help document other community struggles. Then he called Mrs. Chen to ask if she'd be willing to teach gardening techniques to other neighborhoods by the time he went to bed. He had a dozen new contacts from communities across the country, each one dealing with their own version of the Mailbox war. The sculpture stood in the garden, illuminated by solar lights, its copper branches reaching toward stars that were barely visible through the city lights. But Daniel knew they were there, just as he knew that somewhere in Detroit. A year later, Daniel stood before the House Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development. The same nervous energy he'd felt during his first HOA meeting, now amplified by the gravity of federal legislation. The hearing room was packed with representatives from communities across the country, each one implementing some version of the Willowbrook model. "Mr. Rivera," Committee Chair Representative Martinez began, "can you explain to the committee how the Community Empowerment Act would prevent situations like the one you experienced?" Daniel looked out at the audience, spotting familiar faces from his journey. Tom Martinez was there with his camera, still documenting everything. Mrs. Chen had flown in from California, wearing a traditional Chinese dress that would have been forbidden under the old HOA rules. Representative Martinez, "The most important thing this act does is require transparency in community governance. HOAs would have to publish their budgets, their decision-making processes, and their enforcement patterns. Most discrimination thrives in darkness, but isn't that just more government regulation? No, sir. It's community empowerment. The Act doesn't tell communities what to do, gives residents the tools to hold their leaders accountable. It's about making sure that what happened in Willowbrook can't happen anywhere else. Daniel outlined the key provisions of the legislation: mandatory financial audits for HOAs, resident rights to appeal decisions, and federal oversight of discrimination complaints. But the heart of the act was something more revolutionary: right of communities to dissolve discriminatory governance structures and create new models of local democracy. Mr. Rivera, critics argue that this legislation would weaken property values and community standards. How do you respond? Daniel thought about Patricia Whitmore, about the fear that had driven her campaign of control and discrimination. Representative, I'd argue that discrimination and corruption are what weaken communities. Property values in Willowbrook have actually increased since we dissolved our HOA when neighbors trust each other, when they work together instead of against each other, when they celebrate diversity instead of fearing it. That's when communities thrive. After his testimony, Daniel was surrounded by representatives from communities implementing their own versions of the Willowbrook model. Marcus Thompson from Detroit, whose memorial to his son had sparked a similar battle that ended with his HOA being dissolved. Sarah Kim from Portland, whose community garden had become a model for urban food security. Roberto Silva from Phoenix, whose fight against discriminatory enforcement had led to a complete overhaul of his city's housing policies. Daniel, Marcus said, I wanted to thank you. We have 47 families participating, and the city council is considering making it an official park. That's your victory, not mine, Daniel replied. You did the work. You stood up for what was right. We all did, Sarah Kim added, but you showed us it was possible. As the hearing concluded, Daniel found himself in the Capitol Rotunda, looking up at the painted ceiling and thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The scared postal worker who just wanted to keep his mailbox had somehow become part of a national movement for housing justice and community empowerment. Alina Vasquez approached with her recorder. One more interview for the follow-up article. Always. Working, Daniel said with a smile. The story's not over. The Community Empowerment Act is expected to pass the House next month. If it becomes law, it could affect millions of families living under discriminatory HOA rules. It's not about the law, Daniel said. Laws are just words on paper. It's about communities deciding they're not going to accept injustice as normal anymore. Speaking of which, I heard about your latest project. Daniel's latest project was something he'd never intended to start: a national network of communities transitioning away from traditional HOA governance. The Willowbrook Foundation, funded by Lisa Whitmore-Chune's donation and federal grants, provided legal aid, organizing, support, and technical assistance to neighborhoods fighting discrimination. We're working with 67 communities now, Daniel said. Daniel considered the question. In a few hours, he'd fly back to California, back to his job delivering mail and his life in the community garden. But he'd also continue serving on the state commission, consulting with communities across the country, and advocating for policies that empowered residents instead of restricting them. I want to go home and help Mrs. Chen plant the spring vegetables, he said. Everything else is just details. But as he walked through the Capitol building, Daniel's phone buzzed with messages from communities across the country. A text from a grandmother in Alabama whose HOA was trying to ban her grandchildren's playground equipment, an email from a veteran in Colorado whose memorial garden was being threatened. Each message represented a family, a community, a moment when someone had to decide whether to accept injustice or stand up for what was right. Daniel boarded his flight home, thinking about the sculpture waiting in his front yard, the twisted copper and ceramic birds that had started this entire journey, now surrounded by a garden that had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conflict. As the plane lifted off, he looked down at the cities sprawling below and wondered how many neighborhoods were struggling with their own versions of the mailbox war, how many families were being targeted by discriminatory rules, how many communities were waiting for someone to make the first move toward justice. The answer, he knew, was too many. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt optimistic about the future. The Willowbrook model was spreading, communities were organizing, and federal legislation was moving toward passage. The work was far from over, but the movement was unstoppable. His phone buzzed with one more message, this one from Mrs. Chen. The spring bulbs are ready for planting. The children want to dedicate the new section to communities that refuse to give up. When will you be home? Daniel smiled and typed back, on my way. 6 hours later, he knelt in the rich soil of the Rivera Community Art Garden, helping plant bulbs that would bloom in the spring. Around him, neighbors worked together to tend their shared space. Children played between the sculptures, and the memorial plaques caught the afternoon sun. The mailbox sculpture stood at the center of it all, its copper branches reaching toward the sky like a prayer answered, a symbol of resistance that had become a beacon of hope. Daniel had never wanted to be a hero or a symbol or a national spokesperson. He'd just wanted to honor his father's memory with a piece of art that meant something to him. But sometimes, standing up for one small thing opens the door to justice for everyone. The garden thrived, the community healed, and across the country, other neighborhoods began their own mailbox wars, not with sledgehammers and demolition crews, but with courage, cooperation, and the radical belief that communities could govern themselves through love instead of fear. The mailbox sculpture remains standing, a testament to the power of refusing to accept injustice as normal. And in gardens and communities across America, other sculptures, other memorials, other symbols of hope were taking root, protected by neighbors who had learned that the most powerful weapon against discrimination was simply showing up for each other. The war was over. The healing had begun. And somewhere in a garage in California, Daniel Rivera was already working on his next piece of art, not knowing that it too would become a symbol of something larger than himself, something that would inspire other communities to stand up, speak out, and refuse to let fear divide them. The legacy of the mailbox war wasn't a sculpture or a garden or a law. It was the simple, revolutionary idea that communities could choose cooperation over conflict, that neighbors could choose love over fear, and that justice was possible when people decided to make it happen. The rest was just details. Asterisk.